Professor, real quick, I do got a question.
Go.
That exam had 102 questions, right?
It did.
When I was those 2 questions extra credit questions, or those are just like extra, or those are just counted like regular?
No, extra credit. They're extra credit.
Okay.
Your grade is out of 100 because of extra credit. Okay.
Okay. Perfect.
Right.
Thank
It's
you.
always that way. Always that way. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's get into the endocrine system. The endocrine system is probably one of the most important systems in your body because it controls the body functions, just like the nervous system. If you had AP1, the nervous system controls almost everything. Well, so does the endocrine system. In the nervous system, things are controlled by neurotransmitters. In the endocrine system, things are controlled by hormones. And most of these hormones circulate in the blood and bind receptors on what we call target cells. So the majority of hormones that are in your body target cells that respond to their hormone. Okay? There is a huge difference between the nervous system and the endocrine system. The nervous system, with its neurotransmitters, acts instantaneously within milliseconds. However, the endocrine system can take seconds to hours to days to give you a response. The nervous system, the reactions are very brief, less than a second, milliseconds. But in the endocrine system, the reaction can be from seconds to days. So it's a much longer reacting system. So what's the difference between exocrine glands and endocrine glands? Well, if you took AP1, you learned about exocrine glands. Exocrine glands secrete their products into ducts. None of their products are hormones. Basically, the exocrine glands are sweat glands, oil glands, mucus glands, and the digestive glands that you just learned. So they secrete their products into ducts. The endocrine glands secrete hormones. They secrete their hormones directly into the blood. There are no ducts. That differentiates them from the exocrine system. All right, again, the endocrine glands secrete their hormones into the bloodstream. There are no ducts. These hormones diffuse into the bloodstream and are carried to the target cells that hormone targets. The endocrine glands are the pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the adrenal glands, and the pineal glands. There are others, and we'll talk about the entire system. Certain organs and tissues that are not part of the endocrine system also secrete hormones, and you've already learned some of them. You learned that the kidney secretes 3 hormones, and it's not part of the endocrine system. You've learned that the heart produces ANP, a hormone that will lower your blood pressure, and it is not part of the endocrine system. You've learned that the stomach produces gastrin, a hormone that will increase gastric acid. It's not part of the endocrine system. You also learned that the small intestine produces two hormones, CCK and secretin, and it's not part of the endocrine system. Now we're talking about the endocrine system. Okay? So even fat cells produce hormones. It's not part of the endocrine system, but we'll talk about the major glands of the endocrine system. And basically, here are the major glands of the endocrine system. You have the pituitary gland and the pineal gland. That is within your skull. Then you have the thyroid gland, which is basically in your neck. You have the thymus gland, which is in your mediastinum. You also have the adrenal gland, two of them, one on either side. And you also have the pancreas. And also, I don't want to forget that also in the thyroid gland, there are parathyroid glands. We'll talk about every single one of them. And the reproductive system, which we'll talk about next week, is the ovaries in females and the testicles in males. Those are the reproductive endocrine glands. So what do you have to know about hormones? Well, you have to know that they're in the bloodstream. They only affect target cells that possess the receptor for that hormone on the target cell. And these receptors are being continually synthesized or broken down. Receptors on target cells can be downregulated in the presence of high concentrations of hormone or upregulated in the presence of low concentrations of hormone. So what happens is the endocrine cell secretes its hormone into the bloodstream. And because there is a target cell with a receptor on it that receives this hormone. And there are two types of hormones, water-soluble and fat-soluble. Hormones that don't circulate are called paracrines. And these are the ones that we have really talked about already, especially in the stomach. Gastrin is a paracrine because it only affects the cells of the stomach. Basically, it's called an autocrine because it's produced by the stomach and only targets the cells of the stomach. So those are local hormones, paracrines and autocrines. But what we're talking about are endocrines. Okay? These hormones circulate in the blood and go through the entire bloodstream. And again, there are two types of hormones. They are either lipid soluble, otherwise known as steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, or nitric acid, or water soluble. And the water soluble proteins, hormones, are amines. And there are only two amines. And those two amines are epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, and I'm going to focus on the amine hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine. Yes, there are other protein and peptide hormones or icosanoid proteins, but I want you to know the lipid-soluble and the water-soluble proteins. The water-soluble proteins circulate freely in the plasma. The lipid-soluble proteins have to be bound to transport proteins. Lipid cannot get into the cell unless it is attached to protein. It's very important to understand that. Okay? So here are the lipid-soluble proteins, and they are known as steroid hormones for the most part. And the steroid hormones have a structure in them. I don't know who is a chemist in the audience, but what is this structure? Does anyone know what this basic structure is? Who are the chemists? This basic structure is cholesterol. So all the steroid hormones come from cholesterol. And those hormones are the ones that are produced by the adrenal cortex, the ones that are produced by the kidneys, the ones that are produced by the testes, and the ones that are produced by the ovaries. These are all lipid-soluble hormones. The other lipid-soluble hormones are the thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, which we'll talk about, and they come from the thyroid gland. And then you have a gas called nitric oxide, which basically comes from your arteries. The water-soluble proteins. Basically, the water-soluble proteins are all the other hormones. And you've already learned about some of these hormones, but the big two are epinephrine and norepinephrine. They are the amines. They're actually called catecholamines, and they come from the adrenal medulla. The hormone melatonin comes from the pineal gland. The hormones histamine and serotonin come from your white cells or your platelets. And then we have the hypothalamic hormones, oxytocin, and you already know this one, ADH. And they come from the hypothalamus. They're stored in the posterior pituitary. And then you have all the hormones of the anterior pituitary, which we will certainly go into. Then you have the hormones of the pancreas, the hormones of the parathyroid glands, the hormone, another hormone produced by the thyroid gland. And you know these already: gastrin, secretin, cholecystokinin. You know about erythropoietin. You may remember leptin from the adipose tissue. And we also talk about prostaglandins and leukotrienes, which are basically in all cells except for your red blood cells. So, how does your body respond to hormones? Well, the responses to the same hormone are different for every cell. Every target cell has a different response. The response could mean making new molecules, changing the permeability of the cell membrane, stimulating transport of a substance in and out of the cell, altering the rate of metabolic actions, or causing contraction of smooth and cardiac muscle. The lipid-soluble proteins are bound to receptors within target cells. Remember, a lipid-soluble protein cannot get into the cell unless they are transported by a protein into the cell. So when a lipid-soluble hormone gets into the cell, it's got to be attached to a transport protein. When it comes into the cell, it affects the DNA and RNA of your cell, producing mRNA, which produces more proteins, more proteins. So it directly does that. A water-soluble hormone gets directly into the cell. It is known as the second messenger theory. The first messenger is the hormone. It binds to its receptor in the cell membrane and activates a G protein, which then activates an enzyme called adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase attacks cyclic AMP, which then converts ATP into cyclic AMP, and it is activated by the enzyme adenyl cyclase. Okay, so when a water-soluble hormone gets into the cell, it attacks ATP and converts it to cyclic AMP. This is known as the second messenger. The hormone is the first messenger. When it becomes the second messenger, because of activated adenyl cyclase, it activates protein kinases in your cell to produce more protein. The reaction is stopped by phosphodiesterase. Phosphodiesterase will stop the reaction, but it is known as the second messenger theory. The water-soluble hormones come into the cell membrane, activates the enzyme adenyl cyclase, which converts ATP into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP becomes the second messenger that activates the kinases in your cell to produce more proteins. The reaction is stopped by another enzyme called phosphodiesterase. Target cells respond to a hormone based on how much hormone is in the blood, how many hormone receptors are on target cells, what other hormones are around. Some hormones work together with a second hormone, and this is called synergism or a synergistic effect. Some hormones oppose the action of others, and that opposition is called the antagonistic effect. So they either work together, synergism, or antagonism against each other. And we will talk more about that. Most hormones are secreted in small bursts. It's usually secreted by the nervous system, chemical changes in the blood, or other hormones. The majority of hormone regulation in your blood is achieved by negative feedback. When something is high, it's got to be now low to produce homeostasis. If something is low, it's got to be higher. That's negative feedback. The opposite is how the hormone works. I would say 99% of all hormone reactions in your body are achieved by negative feedback. There are a few hormones that operate via positive feedback. And we'll talk about positive feedback when we talk about the reproductive system. Okay, I'm going to talk today about the pituitary, and then And then I'm going to talk on Thursday about the rest of the endocrine system. But what I want you to know about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland is that they work together. They work together. Now, if you can remember from AP1, the hypothalamus is part of your brain. Okay? But they work together. They are connected. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland by a stalk. And this stalk is called the infundibulum. The pituitary gland is divided. This is the pituitary gland. It is divided into two sections, a posterior pituitary and an anterior pituitary. The majority of the hormones produced in the anterior pituitary. This is 2/3 of your pituitary, the anterior pituitary. It produces about 7 hormones. The posterior pituitary produces no hormones, but it stores hormones. And we'll talk about both the anterior and the posterior pituitary today. Okay. The anterior lobe of the pituitary makes up 3/4 of the weight of the pituitary gland, and it secretes 7 hormones. And yes, I want you to know all 7. The posterior pituitary is made up of nervous tissue and releases 2 hormones that are made not in the posterior lobe, but in the hypothalamus. This is the reason it's called the neurohypophysis, because the hormones are not produced in the posterior lobe, they're produced in the hypothalamus. The posterior lobe secretes 2 hormones. The word is secrete, not produced. The anterior lobe, known as the adenohypophysis, produces and secretes 7 hormones because they are all produced in the anterior lobe. Okay? The hypothalamus, part of your brain, controls the majority of the endocrine system. Not all of it, but the majority of it. It stimulates the pituitary gland to release its hormones. It inhibits the pituitary gland to release its hormones. I am not going to dwell on inhibiting hormones. These are not important. The important hormones are the releasing hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland connect not only in structure, but also in vascularity through a system called the hypophyseal portal system. That is the nervous and arterial and venous system of the hypophyseal portal system. Okay? Here's the hypothalamus. Here is the anterior pituitary. Here is the posterior pituitary. They are connected by the infundibulum, and they're connected by arteries and veins, and also nervous system. All right? We will talk about each of these hormones that are produced. Remember, the anterior pituitary produces 7 hormones. The posterior pituitary secretes 2 hormones. The posterior pituitary does not produce any hormones. It just stores them. It just stores them. Okay? And you can kind of see what hormones are produced by the anterior pituitary. And we'll talk about it. There's a better slide coming up. And here is the slide. I want you to know about the cells of the anterior pituitary. There's a hormone called growth hormone. It is the majority of hormones that is produced by the anterior pituitary. And it is produced by somatotropic cells. So somatotrope means body cell. So growth hormone makes you grow, obviously. Okay? And it is produced by somatotropes. So what growth hormone does, it stimulates all the target cells of your body involved in growth. That's every cell in your body. As you get older, you grow. Every cell in your body grows. So growth hormone produced by somatotropes, the target cells, are every cell of your body. Thyroid stimulating hormone is exactly what it says. It stimulates the thyroid gland and is produced by thyrotropes. The gonadotropes, gonado means your gonads, and they produce two hormones. Follicle stimulating hormone, which we'll talk about in the reproductive system, and a luteinizing hormone, which we'll talk about in the reproductive system. Another hormone produced by the cells of the anterior pituitary is prolactin, and it's produced by lactotropes. And this hormone stimulates milk production, prolactin, milk production. You also have corticotropic cells in the anterior pituitary, which produce the major hormone, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal gland. That's why it's called adrenocorticotropic. It stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce hormones. It also produces melanocyte stimulating hormone. Melanocyte stimulating hormone affects the cells of your skin to change color. This is why you tan, because of MSH. So you have somatotropes, thyrotropes, gonadotropes, lactotropes, and corticotropes. These are the cells of the anterior pituitary gland. These are the cells that produce hormones that stimulate target cells in your body. And it's all done by negative feedback. It's all done by negative feedback. We'll talk a lot more about negative feedback, but it's all done by negative feedback. Okay? For instance, from the corticotropic cells or the tropic cells in your pituitary that produce ACTH. ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone. This stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. When there's too much cortisol in your body, cortisol levels will stop you from producing corticotropic hormone, ACTH. So it will stop. It's all negative feedback. The most plentiful anterior pituitary hormone is human growth hormone. It is produced by somatotropes. It is controlled by the hypothalamus. In the event of hypoglycemia, decreased blood levels of fatty acid, increased blood levels of amino acid, sympathetic activity, deep sleep, the hypothalamus will secrete growth hormone releasing hormone, stimulating the pituitary to produce growth hormone. As your cells get bigger, the liver, the bone, the skeletal muscle, and cartilage get bigger, it will stimulate the pituitary to stop secreting growth hormone. Okay? All negative feedback. And here's the negative feedback. When you have high blood sugar, increase in fatty acids, decrease in amino acids, you're getting too much weight, you're getting older, you stop growing because it inhibits the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. So, there are 7 hormones produced in the anterior pituitary gland. They are human growth hormone, which stimulates all the cells of your body to grow. Thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates the thyroid gland to produce its hormones. Follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone, which stimulates the ovaries and testes to produce their hormones. Prolactin, which stimulates the breast to produce milk. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete its hormones, and melanocyte stimulating hormone to stimulate the skin, to stimulate melanocytes to produce melanin. So you'll have a tan. You'll have a tan. Okay? That's the anterior pituitary. And you can kind of see this is what we sort of said, but it is a review. It is a review. Okay? It's a review. Again, the posterior pituitary does not make any protein, any hormones. It stores the hormones that are made in the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. And the 2 hormones that it stores is oxytocin and ADH. You already know what ADH does, but we're going to certainly talk about it. Okay? But the hypothalamus produces these hormones. The posterior pituitary stores them, and there are only 2, oxytocin and ADH. And we will talk much more about oxytocin when we talk about the reproductive system. But a little bit about oxytocin. Oxytocin, I want you to remember this. It is known as the ejection hormone. It is released in response to stretching of the uterus and cervix during childbirth. It is the ejection hormone. It ejects the baby from the mother's uterus. It enhances contractions. And when you enhance contractions when you're in labor, you will produce a baby to the outside world. Not only does it eject the baby, it also ejects milk from the mammary glands in response to a suckling neonate. So it is the ejection hormone. Please understand that prolactin that comes from the anterior pituitary is the hormone of milk production. Oxytocin that is secreted by the posterior pituitary is the ejection of milk. So you have one that produces the milk, that's prolactin, and one that ejects the milk, and that is oxytocin. It also ejects the baby, okay? And I'm going to tell you a third function that's not on this slide. It is the love hormone. Oxytocin is the love hormone. It's what makes you bond to your mate. It's what makes you cuddle after sex. It is the enhancer of love. So oxytocin is not only the ejection hormone, it is the love hormone, okay? And it comes from the posterior pituitary. Another important thing about oxytocin, it is one of the hormones that has a positive feedback release. It is not a negative feedback release, it's a positive feedback release, okay? If you are delivering a baby and your uterus contracts, the contractions of your uterus will stimulate the posterior pituitary to produce oxytocin, which makes you have more contractions. When you are delivering a baby, if you're having trouble, the doctors will give you an IV infusion of Pitocin. Pitocin is the medical word for oxytocin. So we're giving you oxytocin to help you deliver that baby. Positive feedback. When your baby wants to have nourishment and starts to suckle on your breast, oxytocin will be produced to eject the milk made in your breast. That's positive feedback. So oxytocin is the pinnacle of positive feedback, all right? The other hormone that is stored in the posterior pituitary is ADH, antidiuretic hormone. Its secretion is due to how your blood pressure is, how your blood volume is. ADH decreases urine output as part of a negative feedback when osmoreceptors, they're known as pressure receptors, in the hypothalamus monitor your blood osmotic pressure. An increase in blood volume decreases the amount of ADH secretion. A decrease in blood volume causes an increase in ADH. ADH will make you conserve water. That's its function. And remember, you had a question on exam number 3. Why do you have a hangover after you drank all night alcohol? Because you peed all night, because alcohol inhibits ADH. So you're dehydrated. Okay? So that's what ADH is. It's all negative feedback with ADH. Okay? And this is a summary, and we already talked about it. And I'm going to stop here, and we'll talk more about the endocrine system when we talk on Thursday.